What's up, y'all? It's Brian with Long Boxing While Black, aka Blurting While Dad. That's going to be the next iteration of this entire thing. Is talking about being a black nerd raising kids who like comic books and manga and stuff like that. So we're going to build around that and just talk about black fatherhood and enjoying the things we enjoy. So I wanted to log on here because I'm trying to develop a podcast about edgy white dudes creating stuff because I have an entire written thing discussing, some of basically it's almost a trope where I almost see edgy white guy decides that he wants to create a book that is full of grit and edge and ends up coming off almost cartoonish, if you will. And so I wanted to do a podcast talking about that and talking about what I feel like the codifier of that trope is and show how it's expressed in media and the whole nine. And so, and this is going to be a long podcast. So I wanted to get people come out, reach out to the universe. Hopefully I can get more people in the stream, but reach out to the universe and see what y'all think and get some of your opinions so I can include them into my research. And so I'll just jump into it. When I'm talking about edgy white guys creating stuff, I'm reminded of how many of y'all saw, and I'll wait for people to start jumping on before I get into that one. But how many, when I'm talking about edgy white dudes creating stuff, the joke in my mind that pops in when I'm thinking about Mr. Edgy white dude is Falling Down, a movie that dropped like in 1992, 93, where white dude decides that he's had enough of society, I guess, and exacts his revenge in very petty in ways that, he's lashing out at, he goes to the Korean grocery store and they don't service him the way he wants, and so he smashes up the Korean grocery store. He goes to fast food restaurant, and he's mad because he can't get a breakfast sandwich and tears up the fast food restaurant. And so it's really this white male power fantasy of exacting revenge on everybody that's wronged you, and really just having a prolonged temper tantrum. And somehow this dude is adept enough. He takes down neo-Nazis. He takes down gang members. Another trope that plays out in that movie, which is a wild one, and it's something that I'm probably going to take a deeper dive into because I was discussing this with a friend. How many of y'all have noticed, especially in the 90s, but I see it now too, where, there's a show or a television show and they want you to know that they're in the black neighborhood. They're in the hood now. And they play some generic hip hop that doesn't really match. Like I remember the clearest example I remember of this is watching as a Die Hard with a Vengeance, whatever that third one is. And they want to show that they're in Harlem and they're playing music that really doesn't match what was getting played in Harlem in the 90s. Just from a hip hop head's perspective, I know that, that music didn't match. It was just probably some production assistance idea of what hip hop was, what hip hop sounded like. And, they're just like, take this rapper, let's just find this hip hop. We can get it cleared. Let's just throw it in there. And it really didn't match the scene, but the generic hip hop that plays when the white character goes into the hood, and they don't want to specifically say it's the hood. They show a bunch of black folks standing around. They might show garbage cans somewhere. That they're establishing what the writer perceives to be a black neighborhood, and then they have the generic hip hop droning on in the background. And so I wanted to do something a little bit longer, something that that touches on that. But anyway, Falling Down has that as well. I think there is a scene where they want to show he's in the hood. He's not in the white part of LA anymore. And so invariably, I think the background music is like the Fushnik and something that you probably wouldn't hear in 1993, 92 LA playing out loud. I like the Fushnikins. I don't think that they had a huge West Coast following. I may be wrong on that one, but they're playing West Coast artists who probably would have been playing that they could have used to give it a little bit more authentic, make it more authentic. Anyway, Falling Down, edgy white dude material, where he, the world's wronged him and he's got to go make the world right. And his job is to be the disciplinarian that fixes the planet. And so, when I think about edgy white dudes, and I know that they're in comic books specifically, the noir trend has been around for a long time. They've been writing noir books since forever, right? They've been writing crime comic books since forever. DC was Detective Comics. So the crime trope is not anything new in comic books. But for the modern trend, and I think the codifier of edgy white dudes, and I had this written out, so I'm gonna be checking my notes here, but I wanted to start the conversation about what is it that where I can say, all right, this is written by somebody who kind of has an understanding of what they're talking about versus I'm Mr. Edgy Dude, and I think that this is how grimy and how violence actually works, and it doesn't feel authentic. I know saying a comic book has cartoonish levels of violence is kind of a redundant thing, but it fits. And I'll explain how. But when I think about the person that I identify with creating edgy white dude, and I know we could talk about Alan Moore, but I find that there's a level of nuance to his stuff that isn't just all edge. But the one that has inspired this generation of edgy white dude comic book writer is, in my mind, and I'm probably going to be, there are going to be people that disagree with me, but Frank Miller feels like he kind of started this entire thing. He's the codifier. The other people I'm going to name, they cite Miller's work as an influence. And here's the thing. The wild thing is, I like Frank Miller, dude. I like his early stuff. I was a huge fan of his Daredevil run, where he made Daredevil like interesting by adding a layer of grime on top of the character that was needed. It fleshed out the story. It made Daredevil feel like a real person, if you will. It gave his character a layer of depth that he didn't have before. I liked Frank Miller. I like Frank Miller stuff on Daredevil. I like some of the early Batman stuff. When he came out and did the Dark Knight Returns, he took some of the things that made Daredevil work and imported it over to the Batman mythos. And the Dark Knight Returns is really considered the book that defined Batman for the current generation. And when I say that, it defined him as the head, the HBIC in DC, the head brooder in charge. He was the main person brooding and complaining, and he was the main person brooding and complaining. All right, guys, my kids are popping in. All right, thank you. Are you going back?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can we do that podcast today?
Yeah.
All right.
So, but they established him as the brooder, and he is methodical. I mean, it dark and tortured, and that kind of stuff. It really set that up, and it really defined Batman in the 80s, how the Batman books are written. Because even though it was kind of its own canon, the elements and thematic stuff that was included in that book for Batman ended up becoming part of who he was. And it really informed the character. It informed him for the comic books. It definitely informed him for the movies, because that's been the Batman that has existed, even before the movie, because the movies took it to a little silly part. But Michael Keaton's Batman, you can kind of see the influence of Frank Miller's, how he was portrayed, where he's kind of this dark, tortured person. And it had this layer of grime on it that really didn't exist in the Batman character before. I'm talking about going back to the old World's Finest books with Batman and Superman going on wacky side adventures. Frank Miller really established the dark nature of Batman. And I appreciate that. And I appreciate his early work on Batman. But Frank Miller is the codifier of the edgy white dude creating stuff trope for me, because he not only went off the rails himself, but he led a whole generation of creators, comic book and movie, because we're getting into that too, astray, where they missed out on the nuances of what Batman was in the books and just focused on the edge. And so Frank Miller did come back. I mean, after he wrote the Dark Knight Returns, it really set that stage. And I think one of the things about it was where I started realizing, and this is hindsight, being a little bit older and going back and reading the books. My only problem with the thing that I think was kind of missed in the Dark Knight Returns, a lot of it was kind of this nihilistic view of Batman, like where it's all pointless. And so if all of his work is pointless and it leads to this dark future, then what's he out there doing? I mean, what did he actually prevent? And so that added that element into the Batman mythos too for me. So after that, I'm kind of skimming my notes. After that, we saw Frank Miller go off and do Sin City 300. He did the scripts for, I think, RoboCop 2 and 3. I don't know if the script from his script from RoboCop 3 ever made it to light. I think he ended up making a comic book out of that. And then Frank Miller came back and he did the Dark Knight. I think it's the Dark Knight Strikes Again, which is one of the most bizarre books I've ever read in my entire. It was bizarre, and it took everything that was edgy about, and interesting. It took it and cranked it up to 100 and made Batman almost unrecognizable. And I'm kind of skimming some of my notes here, but the Grim Lord Batman that would eventually resurface in the All-Star Batman series, which is universally reviled. It's one of the most unhinged representations of Batman as a character. And when I say Frank Miller is the lead of edgy white dudes creating stuff nowadays, Zack Snyder cites him as a source of inspiration. Some of the other people I'm going to name, Garth Ennis, he loved Frank Miller's Batman take, and Garth Ennis hates the superhero trope. Mark Miller is one of the main ones. He was a huge mark for Frank Miller stuff. Anyway, my problem with edgy white dudes writing some of these comic books and even doing some of these movies is a lot of them, when they depict street crime, when you see them depicting street crime in some of these books or some of these movies and stuff, or depicting what they believe hood life is like, really all it is a bunch of stereotypes that they've cobbled together from other edgy white dudes writing about something they don't know what the hell they're talking about. And so it's this mismatch of slapped together tropes of Black folks and how they believe Black folks talk. And I'm talking just from the Black perspective, because I know there are probably some Latino folks who have their own quibbles, some Native American folks who have their own quibbles with how they're depicted in comic books, and we can get into that all day long. But specifically as it relates to Black characters and Black life in books, when these edgy white dudes write, even the slang is off. And I have a theory about how this works. I've noticed that when you see a Black comic book character who's a teenager, there's almost this rush to age them up and make it so that they're a little bit older. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that a lot of these creators, these white creators that write these Black comic book characters, they don't know how to write a realistic Black teenager. And instead of asking somebody or even paying somebody to consult or help them write this character, they just do it. And then the character doesn't really sound like any Black teenager. And then since the character doesn't sound like any Black teenager, they say, all right, let's age them up and make them an adult so that we can write them as a Black adult, because in their minds, they can more closely approximate a Black adult's speech patterns and make it sound realistic, which isn't always the case. But anyway, I think a lot of these edgy white dudes creating stuff, one of the things I'm noticing specifically, and I'm kind of referring to my notes, but I'm saving some of my notes for the podcast. So anything I get, I would love to share, but this is really just a sounding board for me, y'all. It's an opportunity for me to talk out what I'm thinking so I can figure out what the flow of this is going to sound like. But when I'm looking at edgy white dudes, and I'm looking now, we're moving past Frank Miller because Frank Miller really, he went far off the rails to the point where he's even kind of on this weird apology tour for some of the stuff he wrote post 9/11, where he's like, yeah, it was really fascist and I was in a dark place. And because I was in a dark place, that impacted what I was writing, impacted what I was creating. And so I think we need to take that with a grain. We need to take some of his work around that time period, around the 2000s, with a grain of salt. That holy terror thing was kind of his unmasking, and a lot of people were really turned off by how sexist and xenophobic and racist that book was, and that was Frank Miller. His reaction, his visceral reaction to the terrorist attacks on 9/11. And so everything that he did after that was kind of tainted by that. And so he's had a chance to, some time to recover from that. And so hopefully as we move forward, we see the Frank Miller that understands nuance, but also understands that being all edge and no point is the pizza cutter kind of thing. And so but a lot of writers were influenced by Frank Miller's edginess. And so when I'm talking about like Garth Ennis, I love Garth Ennis, man. I love he writes the best Punisher, right? In my mind, he writes one of the best Punishers. I even liked Preacher. Preacher is one of my favorite books of all time. The Boys, on the other hand, I like The Boys start now. I did. I follow the books. I thought it was an interesting take. I knew he didn't care much for superheroes, and so the way he depicted them as a bunch of nihilistic, really horrible people. I understood where he was going with that. I know the evil Superman trope has kind of been beaten into the ground, but I was with The Boys for a while. And then the books just kind of veered off the rails with eating babies and the entire mother's milk arc, and then Billy Butcher's final arc. And the conflict with the Seven at the White House, it turned into almost like cartoonish depictions of extreme violence just for the sake of being shocking or edgy. And that's the thing, when I'm talking about edgy white dudes, that's the thing that I don't resonate with. I don't connect with, we're going to have something violent just for the sake of violence. It's not going to move the story. It's not going to allow the hero to be heroic or anything. It's just to shock you and jar you, or to establish how terrible this person is. Garth Ennis is one of my favorite writers, but The Boys was one of those things that got super edgy. And we're even seeing it now on the TV show. When I was watching the TV show, I told people I clocked out after, where Storefront went and killed all them black folks, and there's really no comeuppance for her. And it was just her murdering black folks to establish how evil she is. And she is a Nazi, and so she's a racist Nazi, and so we're going to show her executing and torturing a bunch of black folks. I disconnected with The Boys after that part, and I know that it diverges from the comic books because I've read the entire book. There are parts of the comic books that aren't included. There are parts that aren't included. I checked out, and so it really felt like, oh, here, this is another edgy white dude creating something to shock me. And the violence didn't really have any purpose in advancing the story, if that makes sense. It just served to show, oh, this character is a bad person. And I'm not with all that stuff. Now, when I talk about it, I'm hesitant to even discuss Garth Ennis because I actually like a lot of his stuff, but a lot of it does read like edgy white dude just writing stuff, and that's where I go with it. So anyway, like I said, the main culprit, and this is the person that really got me to this point where I'm like, okay, I can't read another book written by edgy white dude who just wants to inflict violence on innocent people just for shock value, is Mark Miller. The guy who wrote Kick-Ass, Wanted, there's a whole raft of books that he's written. I know he started out. I know that he helped out with Swamp Thing. I think during Grant Morrison's run. I think Grant Morrison kind of helped put him on, but the Authority is where he kind of broke out. And then the Ultimates, he was, he was one of the main culprits, I want to say, for inflicting the Ultimate Marvel Universe upon us, where the Hulk eats people, and you know, Quicksilver and Scarlet Witch are in an incestuous relationship, all for the sake of Edge. Cap is kind of racist, which does track, I guess, considering it's supposed to be the more realistic version of the Marvel Universe, which I understand. Here's the problem: when we start talking about more realistic equals more violent, that's not always the case. And so there are things in Mark Miller's run on the Ultimates that was just done for purely shock value. I'm talking about Ultimatum, where we saw the Wasp get eaten alive by the Blob. I don't know what the hell that was. But Mark Miller is kind of notorious for being the edgy white dude that just includes that wild shit in his comic books. And you just kind of, it doesn't really advance the plot. And I guess for me, I know one of the interesting things was seeing the Millerverse kind of spin off and become its own movie universe or whatnot, and watching him create movies that were based on his comic books, and the fact that they actually had to tone down elements of his comic books because it was too joyously and gleefully violent and dark. Kick-Ass 2. I'm not going to spoil it for you, but there was a scene in there that was so over the top and so bad that the actor involved in the scene refused to shoot it. He said, "I'm not doing that." And they filtered it out. I know Jim Carrey in Kick-Ass 2 has some concerns with how his character, the violence surrounding his character. And anybody that's seen Kick-Ass 2 but hasn't read the book is way more, it's over the top, y'all. And a lot of it reads to me like, oh, here's a white dude who is really giving his approximation of what he thinks street crime is like. I know people are going to jump in to defend Mark Miller. Okay, if you love him, great. I'm not the huge fan, and I will admit that, because his stuff reads like edgy white dude who's never really experienced anything, but is going to give what happens. He's gonna give his interpretation of what happens in prison, what happens in poor neighborhoods, what happens in neighborhoods where there's street crime. He's going to give his vantage point of what that stuff actually looks like, and it looks like a damn cartoon. Here's the thing: a couple years ago, I was going through, and I'm like, all right, I like some of this dude stuff. Let me take a deep dive and see what he's on and whatnot. So I started reading some old Mark Miller stuff. And I may be even saying his last name wrong. I know it's with AR. Mark Miller, whatever. Don't care. He wrote a book called The Unfunnies. And I've read a lot of comic books, y'all. I've read a lot of graphic novels. I watch a lot of horror movies. I watch a lot. The Unfunnies is probably one of the most repulsive things I've ever read in my life. And it's really written, the thing that's supposed to, the hook is, all the characters look like they're out of a Hanna-Barbera cartoon, but we get to watch absolutely horrific things happen to them. And I don't even want to get on and discuss some of the gross stuff that happens in that book. And I know the hook is it's the Unfunnies, but it really, I think we're watching edgy white dude in his element, being edgy and pushing it to the limit where, we're talking about sexual assault in prison and all kinds of other stuff, but he's making a punchline out of it. And, I'm not a huge fan of that stuff. I know Wanted is the movie Wanted with Angelina Jolie is vastly different than the comic book, because the comic book, if you've read Wanted, it's almost unfilmable, yo. Like, I don't think that they could get away with creating a movie that is literally based on the book Wanted by Mark Miller. It's just not going to happen, yo. I don't see it happening. And so they created a pretty much an alternate universe with some of the characters that have the same names and serve the same functions in the story, but it's almost a separate universe because they couldn't. I don't think that they could have filmed that without, I don't know who would have endorsed or seen that movie because if you've read it, if you read Wanted, it's a wild trip. Anyway, like I said, I know that I'm kind of stumbling over it because I'm trying to find the right words to connect y'all, but I think that there's something to be said about depicting street violence, street crime, and stuff, and acts of violence in comic books in a way that doesn't look like a cartoon where there's real consequences. I think there's a way to do that to tell realistic, because I think that's the thing I'm latching onto. A lot of these edgy writers, the thing that they want to do is create realistic books. They want to create realistic characters. They want characters that feel more grounded in the reality we currently inhabit. But you can get this sense that sometimes they have not really experienced some of the things that they're talking about. Um, you know, I know specifically, and I think this is the one that sticks out in my mind as one of the more egregious examples of Mark Miller. When he decided that he was going to do a black dude version of the Hulk, and the dude was in his regular form, he was like a scientist or whatnot. He was a really intelligent black dude. In his Hulk form, he was the prototypical, the prototypical black gangster, as envisioned by what a white dude would think prototypical black gangster sounded like and acted like and talked like. Gold teeth, he had his army of holes around him. He was a walking, talking stereotype. All the worst, all the elements of the stereotypes that are attributed to black men and black manhood and black masculinity, all of the worst stereotypes created and put into one character. And it was like, here's the thing. It hit me almost as, and I don't know if I'm reading too far into it, y'all, but I think the reason why that's why I stopped messing with Mark Miller's stuff as much is because it almost felt like this is what he thinks that even intelligent black dudes fantasize about being, the thug trope. And it's a massive misunderstanding about black manhood and black masculinity and how, we have our complex relationship with black masculinity in this country, which is ingrained into the fabric of this country based on the slave trade and how black manhood was handled back then. And it's just kind of this generational thing that's been passed down and passed down and passed down. And so I'm not getting too far down the rabbit hole of black masculinity and manhood on this episode, because that's an entire separate conversation. And I want to give appropriate time to that. And that'll be a subsequent podcast or episode of Blurting While Dad. But it almost feels like this white dude's commentary on black masculinity is every black dude aspires, because the reality is, I think a lot of the mythos around gamma radiation in Marvel comic books, when somebody gets irradiated and it turns into their own version of a Hulk, it's all the repressed personality traits that they want to have. And so it almost feels like his commentary is all intelligent black dudes want to be this super thug archetype that I have envisioned in my head. And that archetype isn't really brought from anything real, because all it is based on a bunch of stereotypes dreamt up by other white dudes who don't really talk to black people that much. So that's why I'm salty on Mark Miller. I don't really enjoy him as a creator, excuse me, because I feel like his stuff is tinged with that. And so when I was reading his stuff on the Ultimates, I was watching how black characters are treated in the Ultimates, which they really weren't. You really didn't see much attention given to any black characters. They weren't centered, spotlighted, or anything. They were auxiliary characters at best. You know, until Miles Morales came along, and that was something that was a completely different run. That wasn't. I don't think Mark Miller had anything to do with that one. But that's why I'm not a huge fan. That's why I'm off of Mark Miller, and that's why he is one of my main. When I talk about edgy white dudes who just write edgy stuff for the sake of being edgy and shocking, um, their depictions of hood life, street crime, violence, and all the other stuff is either cartoonish, where it's way over the top. Like when I say way over the top, I'm talking about like um, Ultimate Red Skull example, where it's not enough to show that Ultimate Red Skull's a neo-Nazi. It's not enough to show that he's not a nice person. What we need to show is we need to show him executing a family by shooting a mom in the head and throwing the baby out of a high-rise window, or shooting a husband in the head and throwing the baby out of a high-rise window. We can't infer, we can't mention that that's something that he's done. We have to actually explicitly show it. For what purpose? Because yeah, it established him as a villain, but he was already villainous. So what did that do? Well, it brought out the people that want to see that kind of stuff and attribute that to that's what real evil looks like. And so I think, and now I'm about to get a little bit philosophical here. I think what happens is when you're exposed to that kind of perception that real evil is grandiose and over the top, you kind of get desensitized to acts of evil that are smaller, that don't leave gratuitous and graphic effects or whatnot. You end up becoming desensitized to that kind of stuff. But Mark Miller's books are always turned up to 100. The violence is always turned up to 100 in the books. And I don't have a problem with violent comic books. I'm cool with that. But when you're saying the violence is what makes it more realistic, that's where I have a problem with it, because it's not. When I read anything in the Millerverse, the violence in the books, to me, looks like a cartoon compared to some of the real violence that I've seen out just being a black person in a major city. It doesn't seem realistic. It seems like a big ass cartoon. And I think that's where I go with it. My problem with edgy white dudes creating stuff is they create this false narrative about what realism is, especially in works of art or in other forms of media, where realism is always ultra violent, grim, dark, bleak for no apparent reason. And it feels lazy to me. Instead of actually learning how to write characters that have different voices, or consulting with people who aren't white males to talk about how to flesh out these characters, they take the easy route and let's just add another layer of violence or bleakness to this medium, instead of actually developing the characters to sound, talk, and act like real human beings. I think that's where I want to go with it. I'm not quite sure, but I know that this is a little bit disjointed, but I do need to just get my thoughts out into the universe about edgy white dudes creating stuff, because I think that, I think a lot of the backlash and a lot of what the biggest problem with the Snyderverse is you have somebody that was a student and read all those books and consumed all these books by edgy white dudes like Frank Miller, Mark Miller, Garth Ennis, and that informed their perspective of what a coherent comic book movie is supposed to be, what a realistic comic book movie is supposed to be. Because I understand that we feel like Snyder redeemed himself with the Snyder cut of the Justice League. I get it. A lot of people feel like he redeemed himself. I'm looking at the work before. I'm talking about the tortured Superman that nobody wanted to see, where it's all gray, and he has this tortured background where basically Superman has Batman's background and Lex Luthor acts like the Joker. So it creates those kind of stories where it's like, okay, in order for you to tell a realistic Superman story, it's got to be depressing. It can't be, you know, the symbol of hope. He's got to be depressed and sad. You got to be a sad. It's got to be this sad, gutting origin story. I mean, the man's planet blew up. That's sad enough, man. Why do we need to add another layer of loss and gray and grim and grit on top of this Superman story? And that's Zack Snyder, man. I'm sorry, but when I was looking at the DC universe, the DC cinematic universe, where it fell apart was nobody understands how to create a realist. It's almost like you can't create a realistic character without giving him a grim backstory, right? Is that what it is? You know, and then when you do have a character that has a grim backstory, we have to turn it up to 11. And so I think Ben Affleck kind of got hosed by that depiction of Batman, who in Batman versus Superman, the Batman that brands people, brands his logo on people like a serial killer. What? Or just joyfully just kills bad guys left and right, which even if you read Batman books, you know that's a little bit out of character for him, but it made him realistic. And I think that goes back to Frank Miller making Batman more realistic by making him kind of a disturbed person. So I guess that's where I go with it. You know, you start getting the realistic version of Superman, who's this dark, tortured soul who will break Zod's neck, as opposed to trying to figure out another solution. You get the Batman versus Superman thing, which was just all over the place in terms of we're going to add a layer of grit and grime on top of this. And it was almost like recreating that final scene where Batman and Superman fought. I believe it's in The Dark Knight Returns. I get my Frank Miller mixed up occasionally, but it feels like they decided to make a whole movie out of the Frank Miller version of Batman versus Superman. And to the point where we were so concerned with making realistic versions of Batman or Superman that we forgot whether these were true to character. Because even as dark as Batman is, there's an element of hopefulness in Batman. And I'm going to break that down. There should be a layer of hope to Batman, because if there's no hope in a Batman book, then what is he out there doing this for? If he's not trying to make Gotham City better, there's no point in him being out there. And so when I'm talking about including, you can't have a Batman that's just devoid of hope, because that's when you start turning into something else. It's not a Batman story if it's not hope. Because if he had no hope of improving Gotham City, he'd never be out in the streets in the first place. So the hopeless Batman, to me, is not realistic. A realistic version of Batman has the cynicism mixed with hope, where he's out there making a difference in the streets of Gotham by beating up low-level offenders and assisting a corrupt police department. We're going to get into that a little bit later on. Having all the resources to be able to affect positive change from the grassroots level in Gotham City, and just deciding that he's going to funnel the money into buying military-grade weaponry to go out and fight low-level criminals. Even then, that level of disconnection is actually more realistic than the Batman who is completely devoid of any hope that Gotham City will ever be better. That because we actually see people who actually do believe that. We see people that ignore what they can actually do and focus on things that really don't move the needle. I understand that a little bit better. I worked in social services. I understand that concept. It makes sense to me. It makes sense as a realistic thing that a realistic place that a person would land. What's not realistic is the cynical Batman who goes out and does it just because he likes to beat up people and hurt people. And he knows that there's no purpose in what he's doing. And I think that's kind of what we get when we have the Frank Miller version of Batman, which is bred in cynicism in the system that's failed. when he ends up becoming the mainstream Batman, and we forget that Batman at the end of the day is supposed to be, he's supposed to believe in the good of people. That's why he doesn't believe in killing these mass murderers that he keeps putting in the Arkham Asylum or Blackgate Prison and they escape. He doesn't believe in actually killing them. He believes that there is redemption for them. He's willing to allow the Joker to be redeemed time and time again, no matter how many how many elementary schools he tear gases or Batman family members he kills. He feels like there's some level of redemption to be had with the Joker. That kind of blind hope that allows him to continue to go out and fight a city that is rotten from the roots is the thing that kind of informs the character. Superman is a different kind of hopefulness. He's a symbol of hope. I don't know if whoever watches My Hero Academia, when they talk about All Might being the symbol of peace, well, that's kind of what Superman is. He is the symbol of what we could aspire to be. And he's considered the best of what Earth has to produce, even though he's not from Earth. And even without his powers, he's still hopeful. He still tries to affect positive change even without his powers. And so those are two things. It's not Batman is the grim cynic and Superman is the Boy Scout. There's nuance to what they do. And when you talk about realism in comic book movies, stripping out the element of hope or joy or brightness doesn't make a more realistic movie. It just makes this dark shit, I guess is the way I put it. Mark Miller in Kick-Ass, where it feels like this super dark, like, oh yeah, it starts out fun and games. They all put on hero costumes and go out and fight crime, and then people start getting killed. They go out and fight crime bosses, and the crime bosses are all sadists and evil. And in the face of that, Kick-Ass keeps fighting. I get it, but then there are other elements of the way that he writes that book, which are just glamorizing, sexual violence, where it's just done just to show how bad of a guy this guy is. He's just bad because he inflicts sexual violence on people, as opposed to saying this is one thing that he does, but there's so many different things he does to hurt people. It's done for shock in the comic books, which in the film you can't get away with, because I don't know if they would have even gotten through the MPAA with the comic version of Kick-Ass 2, because it's bad and it's grotesque. And so I'm glad that y'all sit here and listen to me rant about this. I was hoping that I could get more comments on here, because I'm trying to really wrap my head around what my beef is with edgy white dudes creating stuff. I'll probably revisit this, but this might be a podcast topic that I need to spend a little bit more time developing, because I do feel like there's a specific lane that the edgy white dude creating stuff falls into. I'm just trying to define what that lane really is. So I appreciate y'all listening. Like I said, I was hoping to get a little bit more activity, but hey, it's the middle of the day on Saturday. What are you going to do? Stay tuned. Up next, I think the next thing I'm going to work on is, when I was in college, me and my best friends had a radio show, and we talked about mostly hip hop stuff on there, but we talked about some comic book stuff. We were the ghetto superheroes, and the idea was, we were basically black nerds living out our fantasies, listening to hip hop and talking about hip hop on a day-to-day basis while intersplicing it with comic books, because hip hop and comic books are intertwined. And I think we're going to bring that back. So be watching out for the Black Nostalgics. It's going to be us getting together, talking about pop culture stuff. And we're going to have a good time doing it. So that's what I got coming up here. You'll see it over the next week or so. We're going to be putting it together. I'm meeting with my partners here, be shooting them some texts so we can bounce some ideas off each other. But I think that's what we got next week. But like I said, I wanted just to get out here and do something about edgy white dudes, because I feel like there's a lane, but I feel like there's still more thoughts that I need to have on this. If you have anything after the fact, you see us after the fact, leave some comments so that I can see some examples of edgy white dudes creating stuff just for the sake of shock and not really to establish realism. Because I think if I want to fully form this thought, I think the thing that my problem with edgy white dudes creating stuff is they say they're edgy for the sake of realism, but it's really not realism. It's them creating stuff that they only seen on TV. They've only experienced vicariously through television and news, and they don't really include any other viewpoints to really inform that. So um I guess I just need to flesh this out a little bit more. But anyway, I'll talk to y'all later. Thanks for sitting here and listening to me go on about this. Um, I'll probably be back a little bit later on this weekend with a couple of other things that are a little bit more formatted. But like I said, I just wanted to get my thoughts out into the universe. I'll holler at y'all later. Peace.